Welcome to Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. I'm Ron Scholl. Last time on Gas, people in the west end of the evacuation zone complained of smells and symptoms, but they remained not evacuated. And while responders prepared for a long evacuation, residents grew concerned over animals left behind. We now continue with Part 1, Chapter 13, Broken Contract. Albertonian Sean Lake wrote Broken Contract, an essay examining the plight of those left behind. Writing, as it became clear to us that we weren't going home anytime soon, we also realized that the animals would go hungry as well as breathe chlorine. The unspoken pact that we had made with our pets and our stock, the bargain that you give me meat or milk or comfort or a ride through the hills, and in return I will take care of you, that contract would be broken. At the first public meeting, residents voiced anger over their animals. The next morning, Lake wrote, 2 days after the spill, we were escorted to our homes by deputies, a day later than we wanted, but the best we could get. It was the third or fourth feeding before I realized why I didn't feel better after spending that time with our horses. It was that pact we had broken. We had, all of us, exposed these horses and all the other animals to poison, put them through pain and suffering. We risked their lives. And we did it, all of us, because we live in a world of speed and high technology, of pesticides and bleached white paper. Our standard of living comes with strings attached, strings that pull tanker cars full of chlorine over the rails at night. Sean Lake. There had been no plan for humans, much less their animals. Deputy Willis hints, one of the things that we learned from this incident is that we didn't do a very good job with the people's pets. My pets are kind of like my kids. Many people evacuated with animals. Pets were generally easy to move, while livestock much more difficult, taking time and equipment and a facility for safekeeping. Most families closest to the spill left behind any livestock, and in many cases pets, in the imperative to flee. Further east, some evacuees experienced a longer exposure by removing livestock. A new contract was forged as Alberton area residents returned to remove or care for animals left behind. The assurance it was safe to visit the exclusion zone. The techs made the decisions on the animal plan, supported by Waldron, but there were key assumptions: that no residual contamination remained, that any fresh gas release would give responders time to get people out safely, and that nothing but chlorine had migrated from the site. Input from the health department in the early days of the spill was conspicuously lacking. Ben Schmidt recalled, I really wasn't involved in that real decision-making process. Ellen Leahy, director of the health department, wasn't yet part of Unified Command. I know that was a very controversial decision, she said. I remember watching that decision being made at a distance and thinking, why would they let them go back in? But exposed to the pressure of people wanting to help their animals, Leahy acknowledged she might have acquiesced. Waldron claimed, we asked the hazmat teams to go monitor in town and give us the recommendation as to whether the levels were safe to go in there. The health department was involved. Everybody determined it was safe to go in there. We were going to limit the time that they were there. We were going to be prepared to remove them immediately. It wasn't going to do any good to leave all those animals in there. They were exposed. But despite Waldron's logic of necessity, many animals would be left behind again and resident visits would continue. Saturday, April 13. Evacuees met at Frenchtown High School at 8 a.m. for a briefing. The Pet Recovery and Livestock Care Group was under the control of MRL. 3 buses would shuttle residents to 4 zones: Alberton, Petty Creek Bible Lane, Ponderosa Acres, and Southside Road. Each bus would have a driver, an MRL rep, a deputy, an EMS tech, and a hazmat tech with a monitor. Buses would move from home to home, stopping for 5 minutes each, and then return to Frenchtown, where a veterinarian and livestock inspector would evaluate animals. Residents with trailers to move livestock would be escorted and have more time. In the hot zone, hazmat techs would tend to livestock or rescue pets. Ponderosa Acres had a new escape route in the event of a fresh chlorine release. To connect north, residents could drive through a muddy pasture where MRL had dumped gravel. IC warned, this is a very unstable situation. Stay away from the hot zone. In case of an emergency evacuation, Sergeant Dave Ball recalled, we had a siren and a monitor in each car. If ops radioed that a release was coming, Ball would order the sirens cranked, Like an air raid warning, he said. Officials noted that participating residents appear anxious. A separate media bus tagged along, and MRL said that pet and livestock visits would continue if this day's event went well. Site operations were suspended during the visits, except some peripheral cleanup. Workers noticed a small vapor cloud in the morning, which dissipated as the day warmed. No sooner had the animal rescue gotten underway when Missoula Hazmat reported possible high chlorine readings south of the Natural Pier Bridge on the edge of the hot zone. The readings were not logged and nothing more was mentioned. Chlorine gas continued to leak at unspecified levels. A shortage of monitors persisted, and Jess Mickelson said they needed at least 6 more. Though exposed to the spill on April 11, DOT workers from Alberton, like members of the Alberton Fire Department, were put to work in the general area. At 11:43 a.m., John Fiddler accompanied 7 men from the DOT to Alberton. Fiddler monitored. Tom Wheeler recalled, "All of us transportation workers come back in and picked up some of the state's equipment from our yard down here, about 2 miles east of the spill. It still smelled pretty strong. The crew was given no respiratory protection." The visit further aggravated Wheeler's asthma and irritated his sinuses and eyes. Meanwhile, residents on buses spent up to several hours in the exclusion zone. For the entire day, Hazmat logged no chlorine readings besides the unspecified ones from MRL before 9 a.m. Hazmat logged no mention of any smell or complaints. Some 200 to 300 residents visited the exclusion zone this day. About 80 animals were removed. All persons seemed satisfied with the process, a report said. Anonymous. I interviewed all persons that came out of the area. With the exception of a tank of fish, 2 finches, no animals were reported dead. 1 cat was missing, and 1 horse was found to have minor acid burns on its lips and inside its mouth. Animals in the hot zone, fed or removed by hazmat responders, were reported all in good shape. A typical hot zone run included feeding cats, dogs, horses, mules, steers, goats, rabbits, goldfish, and an iguana. Leaving animals in the hot zone was problematic, Fiddler acknowledged, and dangerous if we had another problem, if another tank car had gone up, he said. But I see in the text believed it's safe to leave animals behind, including in the hot zone, despite the, quote, potential for significant releases of chlorine that warranted extreme caution for humans. Visits continued as the 2 p.m. evacuee meeting started. The day's panel consisted of Watts, Waldron, and Schmidt, and Randall Little of MRL Claims, Tech Liaison Chris Hohol, and 2 veterinarians. Notably missing any medical doctors and the EPA. Waldron announced that Health Department Director Ellen Leahy would now be on Unified Command. Leahy had no training in the incident command system. It took a while for us to find each other, she said, but I got invited. Watts reported the animal rescue went well. Once again, any resident complaints or questions were not logged in the meeting minutes. MRL distributed its first evacuee meeting handout, which noted the animal rescues and feedings would take place again tomorrow, on Sunday. Many people saw their animals and left them at home after realizing that they are doing fine, MRL said. This meant residents would continue to be allowed back and risk exposure. One unstated rationale for allowing residents to do the feeding was practical. It was cheaper than having response personnel do it, as in the hot zone. It was also cheaper not to board an evacuated animal. The Missoulian reported the visits a success. Except for a couple of dead aquarium fish and a parakeet, residents gave no published reports of sick or dead animals in the paper. The visit went flawlessly, Deputy Howard Reed said. No resident was reported to have any health problems from the visits, though one resident on the west end of Bible Lane reported some smell of chlorine in the air. Many years later, Jess Mickelson didn't even recall that residents were allowed back into the exclusion zone to feed or remove pets and possessions, though Missoula Hazmat helped execute the plan. We never let anyone go into their homes, he said. I don't think we ever did that. No one went into Alberton for 17 days. More interesting than a faulty memory was Mickelson's insistence that the visits didn't happen because they shouldn't have. I guarantee you that didn't happen, he said. There was no people that went into Alberton. That never happened. Alberton was too close to the incident. It would have been too risky. Yeah, absolutely. Holy smokes, we wouldn't go in there unless we had our double A's on, ready to deploy if we got spiked. But residents did visit, and had many more visits to come. Beginning with April 13's visits, many residents would claim that another contract was broken by allowing them back into the exclusion zone. Orvin Crowder lived on the first property east of the Natural Pier Bridge. His second exposure came during the animal visits. He was on a bus with 20 or 30 people, which made 5-minute stops, ending at the Crowders, the closest household to the spill for this group. Crowder noted a chemical smell that burned his nose when we got to Alberton, he said, at the first stop, right by the school. It got stronger down here, at his trailer. The smell was very different from chlorine, a strong medicine-like smell, or like the stuff they spray the fruit trees with, he said. Only chlorine was being monitored. Crowder's bus full of people spent about 2 hours in the exclusion zone. Not originally exposed, but now evacuated, Tamara Hatch lived just west of Alberton. Her bus was full, so she followed in her car. They had a piece of paper to sign that said, "If you go out to Alberton and if you die, then MRL is not responsible," she said. And I said, "No, I'm not going to sign this, but I'm still going to go." Hatch grabbed clothes and her cat. A neighbor's cat had gotten into the house, she said, had kittens, and the kittens were dead. The mother had been nursing them, so Hatch didn't know what killed the litter. She didn't recall any odors and had no symptoms. However, she said, the house was coated with something white. There was a white powder of some kind that I had to clean off of everything after general reentry. It was just a dusting. This powdery coating would become the mysterious white dust, reported by many others. Deborah Griffin likewise refused to sign MRL's release. In later litigation, MRL countered claims of injury during the visits by saying residents had been briefed not to enter a home if contaminated, and alleged exposure from such entry resulted from either, quote, a failure to mitigate damages or constitutes contributing negligence. In other words, we think it's safe to visit, but if it's not safe, you are at fault too. As the wait grew longer for available buses, Griffin said they finally just told people to get into vehicles and go in. They just sent us loose. Unescorted, Griffin drove in with her neighbor, John, around 11 a.m. Griffin noted a pesticide smell outside her home. Inside, she smelled a sweet medicinal odor as well as chlorine in her basement and garage. Though she didn't think much of it at the time, she noticed everything in the house was covered with dust, like really fine chalk, even on the driveway. After just 5 minutes spent gathering her cat, Griffin found her neighbor waiting in the driveway. John, who had not been home during the evacuation, had now received his first exposure. He came up to the door and grabbed the cat and said, "I can smell it. Let's get out of here." By the next day, the Griffin's cat seemed very ill, and Deborah took her to the vet. They said if she would have been in there even 12 more hours, she would have died, Griffin said. She had ulcerated. She had sores in her mouth. She already had fluid in her lungs. She had matted, runny eyes. Her vet said it was definite chlorine symptoms. Yet at the public meetings, vets said that pets were okay. There was no mandate or advisory that animals be removed from the hot zone or exclusion zone. Thomas Wakeman of Bible Lane and others were allowed to drive themselves in for half an hour, and he noticed a smell that made him cough. Whatever it was, he said, it was horrible. And I really regret doing that. Not so much for myself, but I took my daughter with me to get the dog, because today she has severe bouts of asthma. Wakeman's daughter had no prior history of asthma. Amy Dietz and husband David lived and worked at the Indian Bible School. Dietz had been safe in Missoula on April 11 and now briefly visited on April 13. Just that short time, she said, and that evening I could hardly breathe, and I didn't know what was going on with me. During the animal rescue, she smelled a real strong, weird smell, as did David. Amy's breathing problems began that evening, and a tightness in her chest continued during the evacuation period. Jamie Becker, who lived off Southside Road, came out with her neighbor in his truck. Tears started running down my cheeks when we got to Hughson, she said, and that was supposed to be cleared. She was allowed 15 minutes on her property. Becker's face and neck turned red. Her house had a pesticide-like smell. Paul Lodge, Becker's nearby neighbor, visited on a long bus trip on Saturday. Lodge wanted to feed various small classroom animals at the Alberton Elementary School, where he taught. I really think the first exposure I got that amounted to anything was when I came back for the pet day, Lodge said. I got woozy, and the guy, a deputy monitoring on the bus, said that there wasn't significant concentration levels. His neighbors, the Tokers, were angry. They were quite upset with the monitors on the bus, the people, Lodge said. because they said when they went into the house and the shop, it was really strong, the chlorine smell. And they asked the guy who was monitoring chlorine on the bus, well, come on in. Could you take a monitoring in our outbuilding here? It's really, really strong. And the guy didn't do it. He wouldn't get off the bus and do it. Monitoring was refused when it had seemed most necessary. Paul was really sick that night and the next day, Marlene Lodge recalled. Paul felt much worse than on spill day. He couldn't define the smell. And my skin was kind of tingly on the bus, he said, like pins and needles. At that time, Lodge said, officials had no idea if there was or wasn't anything else besides chlorine that had left the site. He thought he spent 4 to 5 hours in the exclusion zone. Tim and Terry Stewart lived on Ponderosa Acres. On April 11, Terry was safe in Missoula working her shift as a hospice nurse. Her first exposure came during the animal rescue 2 days later. At a public meeting before the visits, Stewart asked for her house to be monitored. An MRL representative told her there were only 3 chlorine monitors available, and they didn't have the manpower anyway to check every house. To remove livestock, the Stewarts traveled in a caravan behind a deputy. Just before the Petty Creek exit, Stewart smelled chlorine, and her nose and eyes began to burn. Stewart smelled a little chlorine all the way to her home past Fire Station 5. As Stewart walked from her car to the house, she smelled a strong, very chemically odor, she said. It smelled to me like pesticide, like somebody had just sprayed the lawns. Inside her house it smelled like very strong bleach. It stunk just as bad outside. It was just a different stink, she said. Her nose and eyes worsened, burning and watering, and she coughed as her throat became sore. Tim Stewart described a stale smell outside, while inside was hard to describe, he said. It smelled very bad. Terry also noticed a white powder on surfaces. As the Stewarts left, Terry also felt a little nauseous with a headache. Back at their motel, Stewart experienced bad headaches and vomited several times. The next day she felt a little better, but with a sore throat and cough. Like some others, Terry Stewart became initially exposed and ill during the animal rescue. Rick Madge of Missoula had not gone beyond Frenchtown on April 11. Along with Rick Sr., Rick visited his father's ranch near the mouth of Petty Creek to load up various animals on April 13. Rick Sr. dropped Rick off in a field near the bottom of the road to halter 2 mules. They had 15 minutes to tend to animals. When I got there, I noticed a kind of white mix between a sort of powder and flake on the fields, Madge recalled. As he calmed and haltered the mules, I could smell stuff on them, a smelly dust, he said. With the mules tied to a fence, Madge sat in the grass and waited for his father. He noticed the pesticide smell everywhere, but without thinking, stuck the tip of a grass stem in his mouth and started chewing. And I didn't really have a great reaction to it. I had some rashes and my eyes were burning. That wasn't too bad. I could smell wafts of air coming across that was a pungent chemical smell. I got back into town and walked in the door of Missoula, and my wife Katina said, "My gosh, you stink. Get your clothes off. You're jumping in the shower." It was awful, Katina Madge said of Rick's contamination during this second exposure for her. As she gathered his clothes, Katina said her hands and arms burned and stung. The clothes smelled like Raid to her. The first symptoms that he got that was really noticeable, he got these red spots on his scalp that started leaking blood, Katina said. The next day he woke up feeling really fatigued and had a headache. That week, Rick had diarrhea. Of the animal visits, Scott Waldron recalled, "We put everybody on buses, and I think it went fine." Waldron did hear some complaints from residents afterwards. "Oh, sure, as you might expect, some of those homes had the smell of chlorine in them. Just because you can smell it doesn't mean it's hazardous to you. I think that did occur. I think there's not anything you can do about it. It's just the way it is. Some people are going to smell stuff. And so I believe that what we did was safe and conducted in a proper manner, met people's needs, and so I think it went well." Waldron didn't recall any argument for having the residents remove all animals on this visit. As for allowing residents to come back regularly, he asserted, "What's the downside of that? The public is our customer, and if it's safe for them to come back to their house and water their plants or whatever, and by allowing people in, it reduced the rumor mill by 1,000,000%. I don't know that there was any major problems there." Waldron elsewhere contradicted himself, saying it wasn't going to do any good to leave all those animals in there. They were exposed. But new rumors indeed surfaced from the visits, a pesticide smell and white dust, as well as aggravated and new illness. Waldron would later be very involved in arguments to remove the animals. At the 6 p.m. tech group meeting, MRL deemed the visits a success, saying, Dan Watts reported Operation Pet Rescue livestock feed was successful today and eased some of the worries of the residents. They went in with monitors and tested every residence before entering. In fact, there was no such comprehensive testing, nor the ability. Residents said virtually no testing was done outside or inside individual homes, even when some residents requested such monitoring, and many residents went unescorted. MRL. There was nothing detected in any of the homes tested. All livestock and pets were okay. They will plan to let the farmers and ranchers back in first thing in the morning to do their feeding tomorrow before any of the transloading begins. So-called farmers and ranchers aside, residents would be allowed back regularly. At noon, the tech still didn't know for certain how many tanks leaked. Car 3 was believed to have an ice plug that periodically melted, allowing any remaining liquid to vaporize. Also, some of the spilled chlorine had apparently penetrated into soil, likewise thawing and vaporizing periodically. The techs considered using a foam product to blanket chlorine-contaminated soil to reduce emissions, but Georgia Pacific was concerned the foam may melt the ice ball underneath and it may create more gas leaking. The pecking order for handling the chlorine cars was decided. 3, 4, 1, 2. But, if not empty, car 3 was a wild card. The techs met again at 6 p.m. after more assessment. Each steel tank had a wall about 3/4 of an inch thick, overlaid by 4 inches of urethane foam insulation, sheathed by a thin steel jacket. All 4 chlorine cars had severe jacket damage, scores, and dents. Car 1 had a dent over 4 inches deep. The new order, the text said, is 1423. The tech still seemed to think car 2 had leaked some, but condensation ice could possibly form on exposed cold steel even without a leak. Car 3, the known leaker, needed another assessment on how much product remained. The rupture was still obscured. In addition, the back end had 2 severe dents, 2 to 4 inches deep. Car 4 in the ditch had the least damage, but there is a thin frost line on car 4 where it meets car 1, the text said. There is a vegetation kill straight down the line from that meeting point. This could mean a leak. As for the Crestlade tank, car 5, the bolster impacted into car 3, which tore the jacket away. On car 5, the text said, there is a 5-foot split at the head where the head and tank meet along the weld. This end of car 5 looked as if it met a chlorine car head-on and crumpled. About 15% or 3,000 gallons of Crestlade remained in the tank. 17,000 had disgorged into the ditch. Of these 5 battered tanks, the techs would be lucky if only 2 had breached. So far. The techs warned, cars 2 and 3 are very fragile, made of older steel, and because they have gotten very cold, the metal is brittle. The FRA would write, the damage to the 3 unbreached chlorine tank cars was so severe that technical personnel felt it was unsafe to pressurize the cars past the pressure which was already on the cars for the transloading process. The techs feared these tanks could pop catastrophically. With the animal visits underway, the techs discussed reducing the exclusion zone with IC Waldron. Ellen Leahy began consulting by phone with the EPA's Chris Weiss, a toxicologist in Denver, about the proposed partial reentry and health issues. The techs also planned to begin pumping chlorine on Sunday, yet still concerned over leakage during offloading or car movement. At the 2 p.m. evacuee meeting, residents heard that all areas east of Petty Creek Road would be reopened Sunday. A public meeting was announced for 9 a.m. Sunday for those returning. For the rest of the exclusion zone, reentry was still planned for April 26. MRL's meeting handout gave a new health caveat. People with asthma or other respiratory conditions may need to take additional precautions as far as reentry is concerned, they noted. This was the first public indication that reentry wouldn't be without risk of more exposure, which hadn't been mentioned during the animal rescues. Leahy recalled, we were worried about if there were any residual gas in a pocket fashion. Another major leak could occur as well. At the 6 p.m. tech group meeting, the techs reported, the incident command team came up with a plan for reducing the evacuation area. The technical group decided they would okay the request based on everything being the same after the 6:30 monitoring tomorrow. Absent in logs was any discussion on the reasons for the reduction. The text: no one would be allowed into the area until after the initial transloading has begun, since the first few hours are the most critical time. We may want to notify residents of the odor of the cressolate. It is not harmful, but it does have a sulfur odor. This was the first time any incident personnel had acknowledged an odor from the potassium cressolate, but there was no evidence the residents were notified. Sulfur from mercaptans was one odor from one type of chemical in the cressolate solution. Vapors from the cressolate in general could be harmful. Chris Weiss: your nose is very sensitive to hydrogen sulfide at concentrations way below where it causes a sort of physical reaction. Now, that said, some people are really sensitive to it, he said, and it can cause nauseous feeling and headaches. But you can smell hydrogen sulfide at the part per billion level, some people can. And it's not unusual to be able to smell it a long way away. Petty Creek was 4 miles east of the spill. But Weiss didn't think there was a health concern. While information about the potassium cressolate was slowly brought to light, little was passed on to the public and media. At 8 p.m., IC held its final briefing of the day. The main agenda item was the partial reentry. Summary notes reflected a debate on how to protect the returning residents. In the event of loss of product, they said, we need a good evacuation plan. Shelter in place is not an option per the IC staff. Waldron: I did not feel any pressure to cancel the reduction of the exclusion zone. Question: is it reasonably safe to reduce the exclusion zone, even in the event of release of gas in one car? Answer: yes. Speakers were unstated. No rationale for the reduction was documented, yet officials acknowledged the need for an evacuation plan in case of another significant release. Residents had not publicly pushed to return to the area. Meanwhile, a shortage of chlorine monitors continued. By the second evacuee meeting on Saturday, Lucinda Hodges thought the crowd thinned to about half, but many people were busy visiting animals in the exclusion zone. Mostly the women came, she said. They were wondering about their families and trying to get information, handle the little details. She thought there was more concern about the animals' health than people's health. Your whole life was consumed with all that normal stuff, Hodges said. And I had Uncle Paul. The derailment screwed that up. Her uncle had no immediate family, and after his stroke, Hodges permanently moved him to Montana and had just packed all his belongings into her house in Alberton. Hodges now furnished the trailer for him and her mother, who looked after Paul. She wouldn't have her 70-year-old mom sleeping on the floor. I figured MRL will make it right, she said. I was so stupid. I was spending my own money. They said you would get everything back. If you need a cash advance, go down there. But I went down there, and it was like a huge deal to get $500. But I got it. I did get a couple of small advances like that. But I just had faith that all I was spending, I didn't think I'd get screwed. Hodges understood that any advances would go against her claims, but she didn't ask then about motel and food costs. Later on, she said, people said, yeah, it all came out of your settlement. That if you got $10,000, then they subtracted your hotel bill from it. Nothing was free, even if MRL had created the cost. But that's what my life was like during the evacuation, she said. I was just running all the time. Through the third day of the spill, there were no further media updates on victims' health, other than that 2 hospitalized people remained in critical condition. An ambitious day was planned for Sunday. Begin transfer of Car 1 and the cressolate car, and carry out the partial reentry east of Petty Creek. But big surprises awaited. Next time on Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. In the early days of the Alberton chlorine spill, a drama plays out behind the scenes as the Environmental Protection Agency, the EPA, is denied access to the spill site by Incident Command and Montana officials. But why? Till then, this is Ron Scholl. Thanks for listening. This podcast is adapted from the book Gas, the true story of a toxic train derailment. Visit Amazon.com to see the 2-book series. To access support material in the book, such as maps, photos, illustrations, and video links, visit my Facebook page Gas, the true story, or watch my Gas playlist on my YouTube channel at RL Scholl.